I'm Pat Doris. Welcome to The Story. Tonight, we're going to talk about people and money that's meant to help them. Before we get too far along, though, I wanted to tell you that, yes, we are aware that the health systems OHSU and Legacy want to merge. And no, we don't have an in-depth story ready on it for you quite yet. But yes, we are working on it. And if you have any expertise in that world, we'd love to talk with you offline. You could email us at our normal address, thestory@kgw.com. All right, now on with the show. We're talking about the homeless crisis and that mountain of money that Multnomah County is sitting on and the folks who would like to get a piece of that. And that, my friends, is our big story tonight. Last night, we told you that Multnomah County is sitting on roughly $65 million meant to address the homeless crisis. They've known about the massive surplus for months now, and it was not until last week that county commissioners held a work session to actually talk about what to do with it. And even then, they had a plan, but they finalized it, and there really was no specific ideas on how they would spend that money. Several of you had your own ideas. Barbara wrote in to say they should buy a hotel motel where they can house 200 or more people and not tiny little houses. Just do something and stop with the meetings and planning and discussing, please. Another viewer said maybe Multnomah County should just throw their ineffectual efforts in the Willamette and refund the tax to those who paid the tax. Signed, John, who paid the tax. And Jeff has had enough, writing, continues to be an infuriating that the biggest crisis of our time is handled by creating a surprise SHS tax that stands for Supportive Housing Services Tax, where much of the surplus came from, with no idea how much it would generate and no idea what to do with it. Incompetence defined. At this point, they'd be better off giving the $65 million as cash to the homeless. At least it would be spent. At the same time, the leader of Oregon's largest homeless shelter and reentry program says they are just 3 weeks away from running out of money. The group is called Helping Hands. They're a nonprofit which runs several locations, including Bybee Lakes. Blair Best has our story.
In a city where agony is second nature to many living outside, one of the services they need most is now in jeopardy.
We would hate to have to close our doors in all of the communities we serve because hundreds of people will become homeless.
Alan Evans runs Helping Hands, one of the leading homeless nonprofits in Oregon. It has 11 facilities in 5 counties and provides 430 shelter beds per night. This includes Bybee Lakes Hope Center, the largest homeless shelter and reentry program in the state. Catherine Wheeler was once on the streets and says places like that are life-changing.
Having a shelter, having a place to call home, even having it as a shelter, just having a spot to be able to lay your rest and not have to stress that, I'm going to be out on the streets beat up or raped or hurt.
On Monday, Helping Hands stopped taking in new homeless people due to a lack of funding.
The money's going out faster than it's coming in, and so we've had to make the call for the time being to halt services that we provide in the communities while we come up with a solution to our financial issues.
Multnomah County is still debating how to spend $65 million unspent dollars on homeless services. Evans is asking for $5 million of that. They currently get $0.
If you don't get support from the county, how much longer do you think you can keep things up and running?
3 weeks. That's where we're sitting. Our financial forecast shows that we go into the first week of September, making our last payroll on September 9th.
It's an unexpected timeline that hijacks Portland's homeless day centers, like Rosehaven and Greater Good Northwest, who often send people to overnight shelters like Bybee Lakes.
We should not be shutting down any beds at this time.
So when there's less and less beds available, that impacts all of the nonprofits in our community, and it impacts our houseless neighbors more than anything.
Now, day centers downtown Portland say Bybee Lakes Hope Center is one of the few shelters where they can typically get someone in immediately.
It's all hands on deck right now. Obviously, you see we're in a crisis. We don't have a lot of spaces. The spaces that we do have available are valued. And so to strip that away from the community, like without any alternative, What are we going to do?
Multnomah County Chair Jessica Vega Peterson tells KGW her team is working with Helping Hands and the governor's office about the status of Bybee Lakes Hope Center. She says any investment they make will need to ensure that organization's long-term future.
We're actually grateful for them listening. This is the closest we've been able to get since we've been in Multnomah County to feeling like we're being heard.
Blair Best, KGW News.
Now, sometimes as a reporter, you can have two of your stories collide in unexpected ways, and that happened to Blair today as she was out gathering interviews. Take a look.
All right, so in a turn of events here, we just got a first-hand look at how desperate these day centers in Portland need this funding. We just finished talking with people at Rosehaven, and we walked to a nearby park to try and talk with some people living on the streets. And I don't know if you remember, but a few weeks ago I did a story about a mother searching for her addicted and homeless daughter. Her name was Jade.
Pax? Jade? Staring at bodies on the street. Like, is that mine? Is that person dead? Is that person alive? Could this be my sweetheart? It could be. Pax, it is her. Sweetheart. Yeah. Oh no, it's not my daughter. Are you okay? You need some water? I thought it was her, but it's not. The same, because she cut her hair. Ah!
Well, when we were at that park, we found Jade. She remembered me, and after talking with her for a little bit, I convinced her to walk with me to Rosehaven. When we got there, Rosehaven was closed, the doors were locked, they were on their lunch break, and there was a line of people waiting to get in. So I knocked on the door. They remembered who I was. The executive director, or one of the executives, came out and talked with me and gave Jade a pamphlet with numbers to call and said, come back in 10-15 minutes when we're open. Well, those 10-15 minutes are a very delicate window of opportunity, and I didn't trust that Jade would stay there for 10-15 minutes. So we stayed with her. Meanwhile, her boyfriend, who we've heard is problematic for her, showed up, and they walked away together. And so now we're kind of waiting. It's about to turn 1 o'clock, and we're going to see if we can help Jade get into Rosehaven. But I looked at one of the executives we were talking with, and she was like, this is why we need the funding. We don't have enough staff. There's only a few people working today, and people need to take their lunch breaks. We can't, overwork people. And so it was just such a limited window of opportunity there, and it's just gone. And it's all because there's not enough funding for centers like this.
And that, my friends, is what it's like on the nitty-gritty front lines. Blair did get Jade back in line at Rosehaven before heading back to the station. At this point, though, we don't know whether or not Jade stayed there to get her help. Blair got in touch with Jade's mom. She had her number from that earlier story. She says she's now planning to come back to Portland on Monday, desperate to try and get her daughter help. Now, let's take a look at some of your thoughts on one of our stories in yesterday's show, the latest wrinkle in Oregon's public defender crisis. This week, a federal judge ordered criminal defendants in Washington County be released from jail if they've been held for 10 days without a lawyer. Right now, that means 18 people will be released from the county jail, and it will also apply to future defendants who are not appointed public defenders. The order only applies to Washington County for now, but it's very possible that it could expand to other counties dealing with the crisis, especially here in the metro area. Nobody really seems to have a plan to fix this anytime soon. The legislature passed a bill this session ordering some structural changes and boosting funding, but that's not the quick fix that many say is needed. So we asked for your solutions to the crisis, and I gotta admit, some of these sound pretty reasonable. Mike wrote in, why does Oregon not have a public defender draft similar to jury duty? Private practice lawyers could be given 1 or 2 months notice that they will serve a minimum of 2 weeks defending those without defense attorney recourse. This would be no more than once a year. It would prevent involuntarily emptying of the overfilled jails and defendants being freed on multiple or even single charges. And how about this voicemail from Steve?
In a lot of states that I've either visited or have worked in for short periods of time, they have a system of having attorneys that are strictly arraignment attorneys. That's their job, 5 days a week. They're in court to represent somebody. Granted, they're not going to be the trial attorney, but they're there for arraignment only, telling the defendant their rights, what the charges are, and getting to the bail questions, so on and so forth. My question is, why can't we do that?
Well, that is a good question, Steve. And finally, there's this from Pat and John, who wrote to us. Similar to emergency department on-call physicians, why can't every law firm in the 3 big counties ante up one of theirs on a rotation basis to serve until this is solved? Thanks again for all of your feedback each and every night on the show. We really appreciate that. And if you have thoughts about the public defender crisis, or maybe there's a story that you would like our team to look into, our inboxes are always open and ready for your emails. You can email thestory@kgw.com or call and leave a voicemail. The number is 503-226-5090. Still to come on The Story. Federal money from the Inflation Reduction Act aimed at the environment is headed now to the Oregon coast.
There is funding coming out of every pathway.
This time for a salmon habitat restoration project to transform a cattle pasture into a tidal wetland.
The whole community will benefit from bringing the habitat back to a more natural state.
But what kind of work goes into a project like this, and how much will it cost? Environmental reporter Cale Williams explains when The Story returns. A year after the federal Inflation Reduction Act, billions of dollars slated for climate change and environmental projects are starting to make their way into the field. Some of it's going toward funding salmon restoration projects on the Oregon coast. Environmental reporter Cale Williams got a look at one project where land managers are turning what was a pasture for livestock back into a tidal wetland.
Tucked off Highway 101, just south of Lincoln City, change is afoot.
Yeah.
For the last century or so, this land was used for cattle grazing, with levees to keep floodwaters out and tide gates to restrict the natural flow of nearby Drift Creek. But soon, it'll be a wetland, as it was for centuries before humans intervened.
We're taking land that was formerly pasture, removing the dikes and any kind of infrastructure that would have kept water out of the site so that it could be grazed by cattle, and then reintroducing tidal influence.
That's Kate Iaquinto,
You can see this is the main channel that we're going to be excavating.
manager of the Siletz Bay National Wildlife Refuge.
So all of the lower estuary is really...
And work like this, habitat restoration that will benefit struggling coho salmon, is likely to see a huge uptick in coming years.
Yep, there's some little fish down in there.
As money from two massive federal bills begins filtering down to nonprofits like the Mid-Coast Watersheds Council.
And there's a family of otter that live around here too, so.
Evan Hayduck, who leads the council, said he's never seen anything close to the amount of money that will soon be available for restoration work.
It is a great time to be an executive director of a watershed council right now because there is funding coming out of every pathway.
The work being done on Drift Creek, which is a collaboration between Hayduck's group, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and several other nonprofits and government agencies, it's important for salmon.
So this is really, really good habitat for juvenile fish.
But it'll do a ton of good for other species too.
So this is a project that benefits coho salmon, but it also benefits a lot of the birds that use this type of area. It's really, the invertebrates. The whole community will benefit from bringing the habitat back to a more natural state.
But that means wholly transforming the entire 75-acre parcel.
A lot of these agricultural sites would be have dikes built around them and all the existing channels filled in to make a nice, clean, flat pasture for cattle.
Clean and flat is not what nature does best. And it's not what works best for nature.
We always say messy equals habitat. If it's a mess of logs and trees and all kinds of stuff, that's where the fish are using the area. And that's what we're trying to recreate.
After several years of planning and design, crews have been working over the last few weeks to restore the messy salmon habitat nature would have provided. They've cut down most of the levees, leaving some mounds to provide higher ground when the area turns back into a floodplain. They've dug out channels that had been filled in by cattle grazers. And they're putting logs throughout the area that will provide shade for juvenile salmon and bring in some of the insects the fish feed on.
There's probably fish hanging out right underneath that nice spruce branch where they have a little bit of cover.
But there have been questions raised recently about how much restoration work like this can really move the needle for salmon that have much bigger problems. A study out of Oregon State University found that despite more than $9 billion spent on salmon conservation over the last 40 years, wild stocks of the fish haven't shown notable increases in the Columbia River Basin. Hayduck acknowledged that there are limitations to how much can be done on land when salmon spend so much of their lives in the open ocean, where pollution and marine heat waves have made things difficult for the fish.
It's a challenge in our world is we can do everything for the habitat side here, and then we're just letting them go out into the ocean and say, hope you come back.
But he and Iaquinto stressed that the restoration work on Drift Creek, it'll be good for everyone, plants, animals, insects, and even people. When the land was cut off from natural flooding, it actually caused the ground to sink.
By taking down the levees and then re-flooding the floodplain, it brings in sediments and allows those lands to accrete again. So therefore building more resiliency against sea level rise.
And the work will help with the cause of sea level rise too.
Tidal marshes in particular are very efficient at sequestering carbon. And so just the fact that these habitats exist are really critical to kind of the balance of the natural ecosystem.
But to fully take advantage of the billions available through the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, Hayduck said nonprofits like the one he leads, they're going to have to be proactive.
We have a big push to get as many shovel-ready projects as we can ready because it's never been like this. It's not going to be like this. It's a fire hose right now. It's not going to last forever.
Cale joins me now. Super interesting story, as always. But on that land, what are they going to do with it? Are they carving channels?
Yeah, so it's really interesting, actually. They got historical photos of what that land used to look like before it was converted to pasture. And you can kind of see when you're out there, there's these little depressions that the cattle grazers filled in where the channels used to be. So they have this map that they have based on historical photos, and they are recarving those channels using those backhoes and that big equipment that you saw.
Okay. And how much is this going to cost?
Under $1 million, which is a lot for you or I if we found that in our bank account. But in terms of environmental restoration work, and especially compared to how much money is coming down the pipeline with the Inflation Reduction Act, really not that expensive.
Okay. And then is it going to make a difference?
That's a good question. And I suppose it depends on how you define making a difference. You know, I think that if you look at this land, I tend to think nature knows best. And so if this land is being converted back to how it naturally would have been, I think that that's a good thing. Will it solve the problem of struggling coho salmon? Not by itself. I mean, these salmon are facing, marine heat waves in the ocean, hydroelectric dams, all kinds of environmental problems. And this one project is not going to solve all those. But I do think in the long run, if you look at it from a wide perspective, it'll probably do some good.
All right. Cale Williams, making a difference. Thanks very much. Still to come on the story, mosquitoes are a bug that we're fairly used to seeing in the Pacific Northwest, but the little bloodsuckers can give humans the West Nile virus. And cases have recently been found here in Oregon and Washington. We'll tell you where and the symptoms to watch out for when the story returns. Mosquitoes can be a real pain in the neck or arm or leg this time of year. Tonight, the Oregon Health Authority is reminding you to be a little more vigilant than normal and avoid those bites. That's because the West Nile virus has been on the rise, especially in eastern Oregon. The virus is the most common one spread by mosquitoes. The CDC says that most people who get infected don't really even feel sick, but some folks do get sick, and sometimes it can be fatal. Crews test mosquito pools described as collections of up to 50 of the insects to see if they are carrying the West Nile. OHA says in just a week recently, they had 13 mosquito pools test positive for West Nile, 10 of them in Baker County alone, along with 2 presumptive human cases. Here's a look at the confirmed data so far this year. 28 mosquito pools total have tested positive. You can see that most are in Baker and Malheur counties, but there is one in southern Oregon down in Jackson County as well. The human cases we mentioned are not confirmed yet, which is why that does not show up there on the table. For some context, here's a look at the totals from all of 2022. 45 mosquito pools tested positive for West Nile, again, mostly in eastern and southern Oregon. A few horses tested positive last year, along with 5 people. Right now, there is no treatment if you're infected with the West Nile virus, and it's not just happening here in Oregon. West Nile cases have been found in the state of Washington recently as well. Christine Pei with our sister station in Seattle tells us what kind of symptoms West Nile can cause and why the recent heat wave could bring more mosquitoes and make things worse.
West Nile virus spreads to humans through the bite of a mosquito carrying the virus. Most people who get infected won't feel sick, but it can cause mild flu-like symptoms. For older people or those with medical conditions, symptoms might be more severe. In July, West Nile virus was found in mosquitoes in Benton and Yakima counties. Most recently in Grant County, 2 mosquito samples taken near Moses Lake also tested positive.
This is just standard operating procedures for us. It's part of our integrated pest management.
Ann Belchick-Moser manages the mosquito control district for Grant County. She says it's common to find the virus in Washington this time of year, but longer stretches of warmer weather could make things worse.
The more hot days you have in a row, that heats up your water temperature, and when the water temperature is higher, mosquitoes will go through their life cycle faster,
leading to more chances for infected mosquitoes to spread the virus. It doesn't spread human to human, rather through other animals. If it's found in Grant County, does that mean that we could soon see it over here?
Potentially. So West Nile virus is a bird mosquito cycle. Say there was an infected bird that was here and it survived the West Nile virus. It could, travel over the mountains and go over to the west side.
Oh, that's great, isn't it? The best way to protect yourself from West Nile is to do your best to prevent mosquito bites in the first place. Do things like wear long sleeves and pants if you're planning to spend a lot of time outside. I was in north central Washington last week, got a couple of mosquito bites. Annoying. Anyway, that's the end of our show. Thanks for watching, and remember the story, our collective story that never ends. The good stuff is up next. I'll see you back here at 6:30, and we leave you with a look at downtown Pioneer Courthouse Square, where lots of folks have gathered for a concert.